I was surprised, taken off guard when I went to a yoga class on July 4th, the 4th of July. I was taken off guard because the yogi, the master, had put on American hits by which to do our moves by. And I don't know if I was just transported back into adolescence or another time to be hearing American Pie and American Girl by Tom Petty. I don't know if it caused me to work harder or if it actually distracted me out of what I was intended to be about. But I was further taken off guard when at that very beginning moment she asked us on our mats to put our hands together and to cup them together on this 4th of July and to imagine our freedoms as they would be cupped inside. Now, I came here to relax, and I noticed right away the tension that we are describing filtering through my body just at the word freedom. What is wrong with me? That even the word freedom could make me feel differently inside. As I listened to those words, I couldn't help but think for those whom July 4th, a day of freedom, a birthday of this nation, is not one of rejoicing. One for whom people are not enjoying the freedoms of the cup of which I am to be grateful. And as she further talked, to think about those who had gone before and made this cup possible. I thought of those who in righteous defiance had fought against powers that be. And I also thought about those who had fought for this country, both here and abroad, for liberty. And the conflictual emotions and the anger, as we've heard it described, as I thought about years of exploitation on land and the grabbing and taking from native peoples. And I thought about the imposing of religion and culture. And remember, I'm on a yoga mat in a fancy yoga studio, feeling all the guilt that comes with uneasy privilege as I recognize the ability on a holiday to sit there and try to just be. And here were my two hands that couldn't contain all the anger that Teresa and Anne mentioned, all your anger and the palpable sense of anger and grief that I feel just going to the grocery store. And in the conversations I have on a daily basis. But if I looked down alongside Tom Petty, and I allowed my hands to be just what they are, which are God's created, molded hands, 5 fingers on each one, what can they hold? What can your hands hold as they cup freedom next to your heart? And we think of Salome. Her name is not mentioned here, but we see it in other ancient writings and believe that is the name of the daughter that is mentioned. It is not quite the same Herod who killed the babies, but it is the son of that Herod, and certainly the legacy of hate has continued on into his reign. We see there this beautiful moment when her 2 hands and her 2 feet are given over into the ecstasy of the moment in a beautiful dance, such that it is so moving for those who watch it, and for Herod Antipas, as his name is, that he is willing to give over even up to half of his territory and kingdom for this moment. Can you imagine how beautiful it had to be in order to make such a concession? It is a moment of some real vulnerability at the power a young girl, perhaps innocent, has yielded from him. There's a quote by Flannery O'Connor. Perhaps you know her as someone who's very willing to look at the dark side of things, to look at some dark ironies in the short stories that she writes. There's a quote that she offers, and I'm going to work to get it correctly. In every story, there is a moment in which the presence of grace can be felt as it waits to be accepted or rejected. I can try to say it again. In every story, there is a moment in which the presence of grace can be felt as it waits to be accepted or rejected. The next part of the sentence is, and basically says, and sometimes the reader won't know it in the moment, right? Perhaps later, as you get to the end of the story, you look back and say, aha, that was the crucial turning point. And that is the crucial turning point when Salome comes before Herod with the request for the killing of John the Baptist, offered by way of the resentment of Herodias, the wife of Herod. And it's in that moment we know that John the Baptist is revered by Herod. It's in this critical, pivotal moment by which he has a choice. Will he accept or will he reject grace? We know what comes next. So despite his admiration, despite the fact that he likes to listen to John, he orders him to be killed, to be beheaded. Do you notice here that it is at the cost of this birthday celebration that everything is festive, but it comes down to the brutalizing of a body? That in order for the political powers that be, over and against the prophetic faith by which John the Baptizer represents, that it is the desecration of his body which is sacrificed in this moment. Perhaps as we think about our own 4th of July, you remember Frederick Douglass's speech when he was asked to speak on the 4th of July about the great liberties of our country and the deep irony that he felt as he thought back to what had happened to the bodies of his people over the course of this country's birthing and history. Perhaps as some of you know, I know Ken had mentioned that some of you have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And the reality that he names that the heritage of this country is against the black body. So that at the end of what was a dance that could have been clothed in grace and ended in rejection, we see the desecration of a body when grace is rejected. Now, worship team, we knew this would be a stark shift. You've named it, and somehow we've got to travel and dance between the head on the platter and the triumphal entry of David into the city, dancing with all of his heart, all of his cupped heart, in celebration of what is to come upon the birth of a new nation. But what we may have missed a little bit here is the verses that the lectionary had excised for us. For even though we love the following of the lectionary that over the course of 3 years helps us to get the majority of the text of the Bible, here it takes out some verses, perhaps wanting to balance us against the platter and the head on the platter. It takes them out perhaps to get us to a more comfortable place of joy where we can dance and believe in the forthcoming grace of God. But these verses that are left out here are important, and I encourage you when you go home and study this week to go back and revisit the verses that are in between. Because this is a David who does not dance without knowing the griefs of this world. We know he is a soldier, one who has killed many men on the field. He knows death and violence and anger. And he also knows death as it has been before him, because at the beginning of this text, the several verses that are there, he is making his way to Jerusalem, and these two that are mentioned, including Uzzah, are helping to guide the ark. They're on an oxen cart, kind of clumsily doing so, right? And as they go along and the ark threatens to fall as it hits a divot, Uzzah reaches out to touch it and is immediately struck dead. This halts the entire celebration. And in the midst of that halting, David has fear and trembling, believing that this is a sign of God, that this is not a blessed motion, The Ark of the Covenant had been away for a long period of time, and here he wants to reclaim it with all kinds of joy. But there's nothing like a sudden death in the moment to squash the party. And so what happens next? But he retreats, and he puts it in safekeeping at somebody's home, and he has to decide, is this Ark of Covenant, this symbol of God, is it going to be something that we can have at the center of this nation? And he does his homework. He goes back and educates himself, just like sometimes we have to do, right? When we don't have all of the answers, we have to go back and learn a little bit more maybe of our American history, for instance, to know what informs the path. And he came to learn that there were specific rules and practices for carrying the ark. Among them was that they don't go on an ox, doesn't go on an ox cart, right? You spend some time in Exodus, you see that there are poles that must be had, that there are golden loops and rings, and they are on the shoulders. You've maybe seen the pictures. So that the ox cart is not the proper way of transporting the ark. For what is the ark? But if you think about it, it is the collective cup that holds the heart of the Israelite people, especially as it connects them to the liberating history with its rod from Aaron the priest that was shepherding them through very difficult times. It is the tablets, the guidelines that are meant to keep community safe and in order. And it is in a jar. I don't know how. I've never been able to figure out how manna could have survived in a pot. But that's what's believed to be inside. So the question is, if this cupped collective heart, somewhat the beating heart of God, if it can be correctly transported back to the city, can it be that David, after all, would be blessed? For you have to remember, they're starting kind of a new thing here. That judges for centuries had been ruling, and we get the sense that through Saul and now David, that a monarchy might be in order, but can it be at the behest of God? And so David does his homework, and he goes back, and he allows others to start bringing it in, and he can start to feel it. He can't resist in his knees maybe and in his ankles. The kind of joy that comes especially through hardship when you've looked death in the face and the grief, and you feel liberated, and the Spirit of God takes over your body. And in that moment in the story when David has the choice to accept the grace that is being bathed over him and his people, he is all in. He is all in. But pay attention that through his wife, Michal, there is still some resentment that lingers. What? So even when we accept the grace as it is before us, there will still be murmurings of anger and resentment. What do we do with them? For David, it's no question that when she confronts him, and you'll see that later too if you read the last verses of this chapter, you'll see that as this confrontation happens, that David is willing to humble himself in a way that she doesn't feel is appropriate for a king. He humbles himself in order to be with and amongst the people and to be a vehicle of the people. Now, don't get me wrong, David has his moments. We'll see some of them in the time to come. He is not a perfect ruler, but when pitted against Herod here, we see that the accepting of grace means something that is going to liberate people, something far more than desecrating anyone's body. And what do we do in our bodies, even as they are strung out sometimes? Can we think about being clothed in this grace? Because some days there are going to be the juxtapositions that sometimes, even though we have hundreds and hundreds of years that are separating these passages, sometimes John is going to die, the innocent is going to die on the same day in which we are called to have some kind of leaping celebration. That some days there will be uprisings in Nicaragua and people will be dying from violence, and still people have birthdays. Are we meant to dance anyway? Can God work through the griefs in order for us to, at some points in time, have joy? For me to have joy at the birthing of my time here and give over myself and my body with thanksgiving to you, and to trust that you too are giving over your body and the spirit of communion to me? Can we imagine these young boys that, thanks to a guiding rope in long tunneled caves, they give over their hands? Can you imagine what happens to your hands when you use a rope over and over again? It must be something like impaled hands given over for liberation. And we give thanks. We give thanks because art is necessary. We give thanks because dancing can't be kept from our toes, not when we choose and we accept the grace that God desires for us. And so I pray that in the coming weeks, and particularly when you hear your trigger words or the trigger conversations that could lead you to distraction, that in the cupping of our hands, we recall the center of our hearts and the people that God has called us to be, each one beloved, and who we are, to live out our identity as nation. The question I leave before you today is not what is your favorite American ballad, although that's a good one. I want to know what art or what activity is helping you to claim the grace of God. What art in the garden, on the canvas, what activity is helping you to claim the grace of God?